Indigenous communities, First Nations and Métis communities like the ones I represent need action now. The infrastructure gap facing First Nations is at least $30 billion, and we suspect that that number is much higher. $7 billion over 4 years is barely a drop in the bucket and won't do enough to end the inhumane conditions this government and governments before it have forced Indigenous peoples to live in.
But one of the biggest challenges that Indigenous communities here in our region face is the housing crisis. And the Liberals, unfortunately, in this budget, while they heard our advocacy on the importance of investments in Indigenous housing, pushed the bulk of the funding committed past the possible next election, a very cynical move that delays the urgent funding that Indigenous communities need when it comes to housing. And I acknowledge that obviously today we're having a serious debate about cybersecurity and, of course, amendments to the Telecommunications Act. But what strikes me is that as we discuss this issue in Parliament, there's an immense disconnect with many communities here in our own country that have barely any access to the internet and certainly the wired world that so many of us take for granted. And I'm thinking particularly of First Nations here in my constituency, 11 of whom today announced a regional state of emergency. And the threat that they face isn't from the outside, it is from within. The threat of drugs, the threat of federal neglect through the housing crisis that they face, the public safety crisis that they face, and truly an unbelievable set of crises that they are facing in one of the wealthiest countries in the world.
So if we're going to be real about what government needs to do, I would take a hard look at the history of the way in which the Conservative government made life more difficult for Northerners, certainly Northerners in my part of the country, and do very differently, something we're not seeing much of from the Liberals, and I can safely say that if we were in government, it would be a whole different story.
I don't know how helpful it is to speak in hyperbolic terms, and I think that we need to be more collaborative in this House, and I'll take personal offense when it comes to how hard we fight on this side for Indigenous communities, and suggesting that, if we were to support this budget, that for those that think that it's wholly inadequate, that we would never have stepped foot in a First Nation community, because that's certainly not true.
Well, I'm not really sure what to do with comments around personal offense. I respect the member's work, and when it comes to speaking out for First Nations, a few short weeks ago, 11 First Nations in our region declared a public state of emergency because the housing, drug, healthcare crisis is so bad. If folks are offended by that reality and can't realize that the Liberals are not addressing that reality, I'm not sure what to say about that. I think we have to be very real about the crisis in communities, certainly in communities where I come from, in northern remote fly-in communities. And this crisis isn't by accident. It is the result of decades of neglect from federal Liberal and Conservative governments.